Hey, everybody. This is Alex Stamos from the Stanford Internet Observatory. I'm here with two friends to bring a live conversation about what is happening around disinformation with the COVID crisis, especially domestically in the United States, and how tech platforms are responding. So very happy to have my colleague here, Renee DiResta, the research manager at the Internet Observatory, as well as Evelyn Douek, a grad student and fellow at Harvard. Or do you say in Cambridge? Is that in Boston? Of course, none of us are actually at universities right now. We're all doing this from home. So we're doing a lot of work on disinformation around COVID with both foreign and domestic sources. But today we want specifically to talk about domestic activity in the United States, and specifically a video that has caught the imagination of millions, that has racked up millions and millions of views, and has bled over outside of the United States into a number of other countries, pushing some really crazy, completely incorrect theories. So Renee, why don't you give us a little bit of background on what's happened over the last couple of weeks around this video?
Sure. So the pandemic video was actually the third kind of YouTube video that achieved a lot of kind of mass awareness around a woman named Judy Mikovits, who's been positioned as a kind of counter-Fauci authority, a whistleblower, who is talking a lot about not just the health implications of COVID and sort of conspiracy theories about vaccines, but also political content related to how Fauci is handling the situation and framing him as sort of an evil figure who's done terrible things in the past. That narrative, as it appeared in earlier videos prior to pandemic, was mostly presented in sort of, peer-to-peer interview chat channels. So it wasn't very well edited. It didn't go very far. It stayed mostly in kind of QAnon, anti-vaccine, and then hashtag reopen type communities. But pandemic was interesting in that it was very slickly produced. It really kind of cut the pseudoscience jargon down to a minimum and became much more of a conversation around trust in authority, trust in what people were telling us, mixed in with heavy doses of health misinformation. And then from there, people really began to share it out because they found it quite compelling. And so it did, in fact, make its way into mass mainstream awareness, millions of views on YouTube, as you mentioned, leading to, it was also natively uploaded to Facebook, and a lot of the framing around the initial post was actually saying, the original text around the post was not about the content of the video. Instead, it was about how inevitably the tech giants were going to take it down and how people should be ready to reshare it. Please download this. Please feel free to re-upload it. So the filmmaker himself was actively encouraging people to participate in that resharing and propagation process.
Right. So it sounds like there's some people involved here who actually have experience at the platforms. Is that correct? There's an ex-Googler.
Yeah, so so Judy Mikovits had a Twitter account for years. I think it amassed maybe 1,700 followers. She used it to promote her last book, which went nowhere really at the time. She has a new book out, and so this gentleman, Zach Voorhees, who's a Project Veritas Google whistleblower, is how he refers to himself at this point. He became her PR agent, as he describes in that GoFundMe and in a PayPal pool document. I believe ran her Twitter account, he says in one video, or is tweeting, created a new Twitter account for her, which amassed about 17,000 followers within the first 24 hours of its existence. So there are a lot of really interesting things, for Stanford Internet Observatory. One of the things that really flagged for us was just the anomalous acquisition of followers, just that rate, the number of eggs. There's a lot of eggs in there, a lot of people who follow one person in there, a lot of, 10%, sorry, I think 15% of the followers from like within the last 3 months, the account creation dates. So there was just enough to hit our radar as a not coordinated inauthentic behavior, but astroturfed marketing campaign.
Right, which has been effective. So right now, the number one selling book on Amazon is her book. Evelyn, this has been interesting period. You have a long history of studying platform regulation and self-regulation of speech on these big tech platforms. So first off, before we get specifically into this video, can you give us a quick overview of what has been different during COVID than historically on these platforms around misinformation?
Right. So I kind of liken it to they've declared a state of emergency. The platforms have kind of said, we're in this state of emergency, and so we're going to exercise emergency powers and sort of be a little bit more heavy-handed than we normally are. And that's really happened along two axes. First, we've seen an expansion of general pre-existing policies that were sort of expanding anyway, but really rapidly ramped up around removing harmful health misinformation and capturing a larger amount of things within that category. If you look at sort of Facebook and Twitter have an updated policy that's sort of getting longer and longer with a bunch of things that they will take down. And so there's that expanded policy, and then the way in which it's being enforced is also different. This is partly because of circumstance. You know, a lot of the human content moderators that normally do a lot of the review around this had to be sent home like the rest of us. And so the platforms had to rely on artificial intelligence tools much more than normal, which is just a much blunter form of enforcement. And a lot of them had to scale back their appeals processes. And it's super interesting for someone like me in this space who's been watching this for a long time. You know, we finally had these kind of candid admissions from the platforms saying, you know, and we're going to be relying on these tools more, which means we're going to be more inaccurate, which is a kind of change in tone from normal, which is like, these tools are great, they're getting better and better. So yeah, and we definitely have seen those higher error rates over the last few months, although we still don't have a lot of transparency around it.
Right. They're actually, so they just released a new transparency report.
Yeah, a couple of days ago.
Couple of days ago, which is actually missing something, which they used to, in these reports, have like a really good one chart that showed all of this information, and they've made it much harder to get into, which is...
It's so frustrating, Alex. As someone like who tries to turn this report into like stuff for my articles, it's like I'm copying stuff into Excel spreadsheets all the time. It's really frustrating. I will just say this report only covers up until I think it's the end of March, and so it only covers the first few weeks of this new emergency situation. So it's going to be the next report that's going to have the really interesting data. Well, hopefully, we'll see if we can extract it around what's going on.
Right. Like they say that specifically here of effectively, you know, we don't have a big chunk of it and we will be updating. It's interesting because I'm not totally sure where a bunch of this is going to end up, right? There's not actually a specific category for disinformation.
Yeah, and that's been a big criticism of a lot of the platforms, and I think it's a really valid one. Like, why don't we have a way to flag, like especially on Twitter, for example, a way to flag something as specifically violating COVID disinformation policies or misinformation policies rather than just like general policies? I think that would be a much more useful way of proceeding, and also would give us a much better data set later on, hopefully.
So let's talk specifically about the pandemic video that Renee introduced us to. So Evelyn, how have the platforms responded to that? And specifically, you know, the big platforms here would be YouTube being the world's largest video platform, Twitter and Facebook.
Right. So you know, generally consistent with the state of emergency stance that they've been taking. You know, the timelines are all a little bit unclear. For Facebook, it's and this is going off the fantastic reporting of Casey Newton, who really dug into this. First, they demoted it when it was starting to go viral to allow space for fact checking, which I think, you know, really exposes some of the limits of relying on fact checking here, because that it takes time, and this thing's sort of rocketing around while the fact checking is occurring. And then once they got that fact checking back, you know, there's a specific claim in there about it wearing masks being harmful, which they just determined violated their policies. So any full copies of the video or any other clips that contained that particular claim, they are now taking down. But other clips from the video are now instead being fact-checked, and you'll get labels and things like that. In terms of effectiveness of enforcing, this is, you know, one of the most interesting areas. It's like, and it's one thing that we'd like a lot more transparency around, because there's this confusion where Facebook says we're going to be taking this video down, and then we sort of just see the video is still on Facebook and Instagram for the next few days, and we're not really sure why. And, you know, one of the things that they've been talking about is obviously, and Renee was talking about this earlier, like this was in some sense like strategic. And so you had people uploading different cuts of it and things that were intended to particularly to avoid detection from the tools that the platforms normally use. Similar story around YouTube. It wasn't surfaced prominently in recommendations, and now if you Google it, you get if you search for it in YouTube, you get a fact check and a lot of debunking videos. So that's progress. Twitter is not is assessing individual clips, and it's adding warning labels to individual clips and to the full video when it's hosted on Twitter. And it's also, I think, and this is important, it's adding warning labels to links to off-platform copies of the video. And this is something I think we need to sort of think a lot more about in this space. This is an ecosystem. A lot of this didn't start on Facebook and YouTube. It started in other platforms and was then fed into those ecosystems. And so we need to be thinking about how it moves across platforms as well.
Yeah. And so what are some of where do you think a lot of this is being organized, Renee? Like Evelyn said, there's an interesting parallel here. Kind of the big example here is the Christchurch video, right? Where you had a community on 8chan who was intentionally trying to share the video over and over again, and were sharing tips on how to defeat the various technical means. We'll talk about the technical stuff in a second, which I think is actually interesting. This is an interesting discussion. But where is the organization happening here for the people who are spending all day trying to re-upload this video, as well as posting links to different sites?
In this particular community, you do still see, anti-vaccine and, kind of Q communities operating mostly in Facebook groups, actually. Not always public Facebook groups, but Facebook groups. And that's more just because it's just the demographics of the communities that are doing it, right? Christchurch was a very different demographic community, and they chose, they spent most of their time in certain places. And so coordination happens where people are. I mean, it's just sort of like, that's the human nature problem intersecting with platform design, right? Which is, Facebook provides certain useful tools. Pandemic has, the videos have spread to WhatsApp. I think even people on our team have flagged, contacts in Africa have been sending it to them asking, like, what is this? Right. We're seeing a lot of insertion into, I still have we've had a text alert up on this for days, weeks now. April 16th, so almost a month. And almost all the notifications I'm getting now are non-English language, a lot of Italian, a lot of Polish, a lot of Spanish, some Russian, some Slavic languages. And so what we're seeing now is the second order spread into international communities, where it's actually not clear to me that any fact checks have made it into those languages, because I see none of that coming through alerts. I see English language fact checks, debunkings coming through alerts, but I don't think that's quite hit the international media market yet, which honestly shows one of the challenges, really, which is if you are going to use to draw on Facebook's remove, reduce, inform framework, if you're going to use reduce and inform effectively so that you're not providing the secondary boon of censorship that comes from remove. If you're using reduce and inform, then you have to have that timed appropriately. You have to have the inform content in some way either written or ready to go, or somehow more rapidly. What we're seeing in our data analysis that we're doing at SIO right now is actually kind of like a 2-day offset. Video goes viral on the the night of the 5th into the 6th, kind of peaks between the 6th and the 7th and comes down. There's an offset there where you see the debunking content, the debunking articles. Some come out on the 6th, often blogs actually, and some media organizations get it out on the 6th. And then the fact checkers are coming out on the 7th. And so now we're looking at the dynamics of the debunking as it spread through various communities, and how that could have been more appropriately leveraged to avoid this whole decision to do the full takedowns instead.
Right. And so to talk about the takedown, so it seems to me that they have not been incredibly effective in taking down the video, that they're not doing the fully aggressive model that was created out of Christchurch, the GIF-CT model, which I think there's a couple of reasons there. One, the actual use of GIF-CT, I think, is pretty much legally constrained to issues around child exploitation and terrorism, right? So like the kind of lingua franca between the companies when it comes to hashing is photo-DNA, and photo-DNA can't be used for all kinds of different reasons. But the companies do have their own hashing algorithms, and they do talk about it publicly, actually. So I'll put up a document, which is, so this is available on GitHub, and it's great because it's one of the first public, this is from Facebook. It is part of their GitHub repository where they talk about the 2 of the video hashing algorithms that they've released that are kind of much more advanced than photo DNA, rely upon the decade of computer vision research that has happened since then. But one of the interesting things here is they talk about the limitations of the algorithm. And in what situations will you generate false positives and false negatives? And the numbers here are actually much better than what we're seeing from an enforcement perspective. So it makes me feel like it is unlikely that the full, most aggressive option is being used. And I'm wondering if that's coming back to a policy decision, that they're not going to completely destroy one of these, any video that has an excerpt of the video anywhere, possibly because there's so many times it's being excerpted. Like I've seen pandemic clips on CNN and MSNBC. And so how Evelyn, should the companies think about this, right? Like how, if you're not allowed to ever have a slight part of the video, it means it makes it very hard to criticize it, for example. Do you think that it is appropriate for them to use the same kind of super aggressive mechanism that they used in the Christchurch video, which was a snuff film calling for race war, in a situation where it's medical disinformation?
Yeah, you're not going to tie me down to a yes or no answer on that one, Alex. But here's some thoughts.
The great part about being a grad student versus working with the companies is you don't have to actually answer it.
I need a job in the next few years. I'm not going to be too controversial yet. Okay. So not in this economy. So it's interesting, right? Because you're watching it in the few days after it, and it's still going viral. And this is the question that we were talking about originally about this. Is the normal concern that you have when you use video filters is that they're over-inclusive. And there are a lot of really important concerns there. And there's a long history of filters for terrorist content and things taking down a lot of like human rights, like evidence of human rights violations and things like that, because they're just very blunt tool. And so the question is, like, if that's our normal concern, and Facebook has come out and said, we're removing this video, why isn't the problem that we're seeing over enforcement? And it does seem to be that, they're hesitant to use the hashing technology for this purpose, and they haven't sort of pulled the trigger or used the nuclear bomb option in this case. And I think there's a lot of people that'll be really happy about that. I think because this is exactly the big fear that we have in declaring an emergency and having an emergency powers situation during the pandemic, is that will legitimate the use of much more heavy-handed tools that should be more narrowly confined to things like child sexual abuse material and terrorist content, gradually slipping into broader and broader areas. And I think, I heard from people in civil society and civil liberties communities who were very nervous about the idea that hashing technology would spread. And I think that's a really valid concern, because exactly as you say, excerpts of this video are really important and are in a lot of really important content around like the fact checking and around debunking and in legitimate reporting as well. And so the idea of completely nuking all of that is a very you can see a lot of concerns there, and particularly in the context of this particular video, where, as Renee was saying earlier, part of the story around it is that there's a conspiracy to silence this content as well. And so the idea of sort of pulling that nuclear option, it's not clear that that's necessarily the best answer.
Yeah, I mean, this also, it seems to me, it's exactly the kind of fear people had after Christchurch, which was if you create this lever, people are going to ask for the lever to be used more and more. And so in a situation where you can't directly tie human suffering right to the video, where, obviously bad things will happen if people believe this video and then end up doing dumb things. But there's another step of like, people have to make a lot of them adults who have specifically seeked out this video, then have to make an intentional decision to do something harmful. Do you, how appropriate is it to use these really heavy-handed tactics in that kind of situation versus like the child exploitation or the Christchurch example, where it's obvious like the creation of the video is actually a harmful thing?
Right. And I guess, the big frustration that I have, and here's, the platform governance lawyer in me, is like, the problem though is like, we just had no transparency around all of this. And we need, I think, to be developing protocols, because this, this is a situation that's going to happen again. All of us have a full employment program for the next little while. Well, not me, I'm a student, but in theory, we're going to be busy for the next few years. It's going to happen again and again. So it would be great to have some sort of protocol around what triggers do you pull when, because otherwise we're sitting there really confused. Facebook said, we're removing this video, but the video is still there. So why?
Well, we don't even have a language, right? Like you and I are using the term like nuke from orbit, which is not the official, like if clearly what they've decided is, okay, we're gonna take it down in context, but we're not gonna use this level of hashing. And we don't even have like a vocabulary we can use to debate this publicly.
Right, and it only came out after, we were sort of kicking it around on Twitter, and then Casey's like, oh, I'm following up on this, and so Casey Newton goes in and gets some more answers, and now we work out what exactly they're doing. I mean, that's not an ideal way of solving these issues. So
maybe they should have an external board to provide oversight on this process. What do you think?
That will consider it for 3 months, and then it will get back to us. I think that's
right. This is actually a great example of a place where you'd want an external board to argue about it. And then also it makes absolutely no sense from a timing perspective, right? Because like, as Renee talked about, you're talking about hours or days in which you have to make a decision before this thing gets huge. You don't have 3 months to have, lawyers write briefs of whether this is free speech or not.
Right, but they could give meaningful input into the development of the protocol that we were just talking about, for example, and sort of developing that for future scenarios, and also force. I mean, the great hope that I have is that when this kind of thing comes towards the board, they can force Facebook to tell us more about what your decision-making process was here, and what is your error rate here, and how are you making these calculations, so that then we can have a more informed discussion about it next time. Agree, though, it's not going to be the situation for that gap between, what was it, the 6th and the 9th or whatever, where these decisions need to be made in real time.
So, Renee, where does this take us? Because I think this is interesting in that we know these are financially motivated people. They probably believe some of this stuff too, but clearly there is a business behind pushing this video and has been extremely effective. What does that mean for this kind of disinformation in the future, that there is such a good model now out there of being able to make money doing this?
Well, this is kind of what the platform was designed for, though, right? I mean, it's designed to help people market, and this is a marketing campaign. So I don't think that that's actually all that different. I think, the elements of astroturfing yourself to legitimacy by getting a sufficient number of egg followers on Twitter, where when somebody glances at the account, they see 100,000 and think that the person is like, legitimate, and those are all real accounts following. Right. There's certain like weird, mental shortcuts that that kind of manipulation plays into. Similarly with Amazon, you self-categorize your book. That actually blew me away. I realized that in 2018 when I started trying to figure out why so many of these things were like, why Cancer Quack Juice Fast books were #1 in oncology. Oncology is a very specific medical meaning. It's not just cancer care or self-care or diet. It's oncology. It sounds like a textbook, right? And it was because you actually can self-categorize. So I actually went through the process of uploading a Kindle book to see how that process worked. And it's really interesting because, the question is, at scale, does Amazon have a responsibility to say, like, okay, come on, like, this is just bullshit? The answer, you could argue like the book should stay up, but it should be more reappropriately categorized. Right now, Mikovitz's book is #1 in biology, in AIDS, in chronic fatigue syndrome, and in science and medicine, right? And so that's a really interesting dynamic just around what information, what metadata the platforms are communicating to people about this product, and should they have more of a consumer protection responsibility on that front, particularly for something like oncology, where, God forbid you are diagnosed with cancer, you go to Amazon, you look for books and you get garbage, but it's in the oncology section and you don't know. And so you start your juice fast, right? And you ignore your chemotherapy. And so there are, when we talk about the notion of signaling that comes through just the data structures around these products, then you've got things like heuristics, like the number of stars is going to rise. There is no, interestingly, one of the dynamics on Amazon, when Amazon detects unusual activity around a book, they lock the reviews to try to prevent review brigading. So so in order to, if you wanted to try to leave a fact check of some of the content in the reviews, you would have to actually buy the book to do it. And so that also creates kind of an interesting dynamic around, like, does somebody want to spend $22 to leave the 1-star review? So there's just a lot of interesting structural challenges with regard to how do you communicate information about things that are fundamentally marketing campaigns and products. Traditionally, that kind of consumer protection, those decisions would be made, and I am not a lawyer, so Evelyn, feel free to chime in and correct me here, by someone like the FTC, right? By someone that has a more of a kind of consumer protection angle to thinking about what are the harms on customers as opposed to just what is the immediate harm of something like, the type of violent videos you were describing earlier.
But I mean, bring it to Amazon, that's also like the classical example of censorship centralized that we talk about is book burning, right? Is like removing books from libraries, removing books from bookstores, or actually, I mean, it's rare in, post-Nazi to actually burn books, but like there's a lot of history of people trying to suppress the distribution of books. And so it's the example we always use of freedom of expression in a free society is that you can buy a book if you want that book, or you can get it from the library.
And I think, and just to be clear, I wasn't advocating taking the book down off Amazon. I was saying the interesting thing is more around the information communicated around some of the books. If you want to go and buy yourself a juice fast book and, ignore chemotherapy and go for the juice route, you have that right to make that decision, right? I think it's more, the interesting question there with regard to Amazon is when Amazon classifies it as oncology, that kind of connotes a degree of legitimacy, where if you were to see that book in a library or see that book in any of the ways that we've traditionally categorized information or the legitimate information, quack books have existed for centuries. Nobody is making any kind of claim that this is new and an Amazon problem. It's more a question of when you have like self-service, self-declaration of what you are, it does provide an opportunity to mislead the public, as we've seen with some of these products.
So Evelyn, who has legal power here, right? Like, so if somebody writes a crazy book, they're an MD, they're using their, maybe they're not licensed to practice anymore, or they are, but they are using their, their history and their qualifications to push crap that's false and harmful. Who steps in? First in the United States, and then you're from a non-U.S. Anglophone country. Do other Western democracies have different rules here?
So I actually don't know the answer to that question, and I suspect it's not a simple one. I think you're going to have a lot of difficult legal causation questions and things to answer there. But I think the point that it's getting at, and this is a really important one, it's one you talk about all the time, Alex, and it might give you the opportunity to put your triangle up, is like we need to disaggregate all of the different elements of the question here. I think that the question of should the book stay up on Amazon is different from the question of, should Amazon allow categorization, or should we allow, how do the reviews feed a cycle, which is a completely different question from how should Facebook treat the video, which is also not a monolithic question. It's how should Facebook treat it in newsfeed versus in private groups versus in private chats and things like that. And we often talk about this thing like it's just one question of what do we do with the pandemic video? And it's actually 600 really difficult questions that implicate, law and ethics and a bunch of things. And I think that we need to be starting to have those much more micro questions as well. But I think the key thing there as well is getting out of this take down, leave up paradigm that so many of these conversations occur in. And it's just as Renee was saying, let's not get into book burning, but there's so many other things that we can do between here and there to put a lot more friction into that.
Right. So we have a question from Emperor Augustus, which brings up an interesting question of identity on Facebook. It's a Facebook page that somebody is using post. Curious who is doing the best job at scale. Renee, who would you say is doing the best job right now of dealing with specifically the pandemic video?
Oh, with the video specifically? Man, that's an interesting question. I don't feel like anybody really handled that well, to be honest.
Great.
So how about then in COVID overall, if you've got an opinion?
COVID overall, I think Twitter's kind of persistent labeling and sort of the framework that they were describing rolling out this week is the most interesting to me. As far as what's being done, it's been okay.
It's been okay. Twitter has the biggest, it seems like they're being the most aggressive policy-wise, but they also have the most fake accounts.
Well, there's just different challenges, right? Twitter has the fake accounts and amplification challenge, right? Which is if they're not operating clearly in concert in a coordinated and authentic way, the being a bot or an egg account is perfectly fine. So that's a again, how do you handle that? YouTube is where so much of the stuff originates. It just sits on YouTube, and so YouTube becomes, you have to have content before you can distribute, before you can amplify, right? And so YouTube is where that content is going because people are sitting home, they're consuming video, they're watching things, and again, one of the real key challenges, I think, is they have the link outs to Wikipedia. The fact checking is not as robust as Facebook's. Facebook does have that, but in turn has the challenge of the kind of ease with which things are hopping from group to group is I think a challenge that they haven't quite reckoned with yet. So it's I'm not trying to sound negative. I can't think of any one clear winner overall here. I don't know if you guys would disagree.
No, I mean, I think there's going to be at least 6,000 dissertations dedicated to answering August's question in the next few years. This is going to be a big multi-year project to work out exactly what has gone on.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you. That brings us to the end. Thank you so much, Evelyn and Renee, for joining me. I hope everybody is staying safe and has a nice weekend. Thanks guys.
You too.
Thank you.